Good morning, ICL. It's my pleasure today to welcome back Dr. Gaetano de Leonibus to speak on the subject of comparative literature and the history of ideas. How many of you know what these are? History majors would know about comparative literature, but history of ideas is even more off the beaten path. Dr. de Leonibus is a professor of French and Francophone studies here at Willamette, and one of the founders of the Department of Comparative Literature and the History of Ideas program at the university, which he'll explain to you in more detail. He's the author of numerous essays and book chapters on Charles Maurras, I hope I'm not murdering it, and Maurice Barrès. Two figures I was not familiar with, and I have a lot of interest, but one thing I think I know a lot about is 19th century social and intellectual history. That was my concentration. But these two figures are from that period, and I didn't know them, so I looked them up. His research and scholarship focuses on the intersection of art, literature, culture, and politics in fin de siècle, France. Fin de siècle is end of century, and the century that we're talking about is the end of the 19th century. The Wikipedia article on Charles Maurras states that he was a French author, politician, poet, and critic. There's a reason why I'm going to read this to you, and the reason will become apparent in a moment. He was a leader in a French political movement that was monarchist, anti-Semitic, anti-parliamentarian, and counter-revolutionary. That's counter-French Revolution. Maurras' ideas greatly influenced national Catholicism and something called integral nationalism. He stated, "A true nationalist places his country above everything." Wikipedia also states that Barrès was a French novelist, journalist, and politician. His literary works are associated with French symbolism. Symbolism was largely a reaction against naturalism and gritty realism, and in favor of spirituality, the imagination, and dreams. Barrès was a friend of Maurras and became associated with the shift in France away from liberal individualism and toward a more collectivist nationalism. Barrès stood on a platform of nationalism and protectionism. So as you can see, these two distant French figures are not merely of antiquarian interest. They are studied for their they can be studied for their relevance to today's cultural and political climate. I recommended that the curriculum committee invite Dr. Leonibus back to discuss comparative literature and the history of ideas, not only because ICL educational policy is intended to reflect that of the university's liberal arts program, but because I believe these two subjects are of inherent interest, and they're interdisciplinary fields, so they're sometimes less well known than the traditional subjects. If you want to hear more specific topics on either of these subjects, please let the curriculum committee know and we'll try to find speakers. I'm raring to go on some history of ideas subjects, like the history of progress is one of them. But in any case, enough said about this. Please give a welcome to Dr. Leonibus.
We're ahead of ourselves. Let's see.
Oh.
Yes, but before this, I want to show. No, yes.
All right.
Hi. Thank you for such an introduction. Let's hope I could live up to it. I'd like you to see what the comparative literature and history of ideas program at Willamette looks like, and I hope it's not too much to read, but basically I'll read it along with you. The program in comparative literature and the history of ideas provides an opportunity for interdisciplinary and comparative study. Like the humanities major, it brings together courses from many departments, but here the students will choose courses which center in at least two literary, cultural, and intellectual traditions, and which seek to get at the underlying assumptions and attitudes of different literary and intellectual worlds. The goal of the program are to enable students to see from a variety of viewpoints and perspectives, and to encourage independent critical thinking. Further, by emphasizing the critical analysis of primary text and cultural comparison, the program seeks to foster a sense of importance, of rigor, methodology in investigation, while revealing the inherent limitations of any particular system of inquiry. As a unique approach to liberal and humanistic studies, the program provides a solid basis for postgraduate studies in, for example, law, education, journalism, administration, comparative literature, and disciplines-based area studies. In other words, it's a contract major. The student and an advisor get together and decide, based on the student's interest, what area or what topic or what period, what field they want to study, and the advisor and the students draw a plan, a curriculum plan together, and over a period of 4 years. So they, and with the understanding that things may change, and therefore there's quite a bit of flexibility in the program. So, in other words, the student has to have a primary course of study, but they could also have alternative courses that they could substitute for what they originally had planned for. The program itself teaches only 2 courses: the Introduction to Literature, to Comparative Literature, and then a seminar which usually has a theme. For instance, dissecting evil, or some sort of theme like that, which draws from many different disciplines and sources. But I thought that, given this, I was going to do something on the history of comparative literature today, and hopefully this will give you an idea of what this particular discipline is all about. It's been around for quite a while, since the 19th century, So, and these are the terms that I'm going to discuss separately, but then at the end, you'll see that they come together. So, comparative literature and history of ideas. Right off the bat, we're confronted with a paradox. And that is that comparative literature is a singular term and a plural meaning. In other words, there's comparative literatures. We're talking about comparative literature as a concept. So, but what we do in it is compare more than one traditions of literary traditions. And so the main activity of comparative literature constitutes a cosmopolitan act of literary and artistic sharing. It occurs when an author or an artist from one culture seeking to convey a particular thematic notion finds inspiration in the work of an author or artist from a different culture written in a different language. For instance, when you think of Henry Miller, he got his inspiration from Ferdinand Céline. His Tropic of Cancer was inspired, especially with the spoken language that Céline uses in his work. And that's what the association with the two. Now, Céline was also known for being a rabid anti-Semite during the occupation in France. So whether that transpires in Tropic of Capricorn is something that a student would look into. besides the fact that it's, the spoken language is what was the attraction to begin with. Same thing with Alfred Dublin, who discovered, quote unquote, a good wind for his sail for his Berlin Alexanderplatz in James Joyce. Again, these are authors that have read a lot, have read, Dublin read James, not the other way around. But basically, what that does to literature is that people, inspiration, build up the challenge for the next generation. Literary people. So anyway, the term history of ideas needs to be understood as a simple general device to designate knowledge and abstract reflection in order to complement the aesthetic or state sensibility of expressed in the literary or artistic work analyzed. So first I will discuss the origin of the history of comparative literature, and then I will talk about history of ideas. So right off the bat, when we look at the history, there's a dispute, to some extent still going on, but that which marked the discipline and since it's been a dispute since the 1980s at least. So is comparative literature Western or Eastern in origin? And the Western tradition claims its origin from Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. His term Weltliteratur, world literature, a concept he never fully developed, and which appears in scores of places in his writing and correspondence. So, for instance, in 1801, he said in his journal, "It is to be hoped that people will soon be convinced that there is no such thing as patriotic art or patriotic science. Both belong, like all good things, to the whole world and can be fostered only by untrammeled intercourse among all contemporaries, continually bearing in mind what we have inherited from the past." Another quote, national literature is now a rather unmeaning term. The epoch of world literature is at hand, and everyone must strive to hasten its approach. And then in his other journal, Art and Antiquity, he writes, "Left to itself, every literature will exhaust its vitality if it is not refreshed by interest and contribution of a foreign one. What naturalist does not take pleasure in the wonderful things that he sees produced by reflection in a mirror." Now, what a mirror in the field of ideas and morals means, everyone has experience in himself, and once his attention is aroused, he will understand how much of his education he owes to it. These quotes, which I wanted to read for you, are very much resonate quite a bit with what we talk about today in many ways, and this is over a century ago. To give Goethe a little context for those words, we need to realize that one must remember that Europeans were still under a state of shock from the numerous Napoleonic wars that had marked the early years of the 19th century. A state of shock that turned into jubilation after Napoleon's death in 1821. Can anybody guess why? That would be the case? No? I mean, you can answer the question now or later, but, but it's a question that will be addressed. I will address the same question when we get to the period of World War II. But so the thing to realize about what Goethe is talking about is that what he was proposing is that literature moved from the national to the cosmopolitan, i.e. to include all different cultures and different languages. And because he considered the national traditions to be a little stagnant. In other words, you can't, well, from the very beginning of when people started writing, and I'm talking about the Greeks, for instance, were already comparing. As soon as there were two pieces of work, literary work that were published, people were comparing them. So, I mean, sure, the science or the discipline goes back to the 19th century, but the actual activity of comparing and contrasting goes back a long ways since the beginning of writing, 3000 BC. So this comparison was facilitated by philology, love of learning and literature, the branch of knowledge and scientific method that deals with the structure, historical development, and relationship of a language or languages, sometimes known as historicist humanism. So in the act of comparativism, or comparativism rather, in the 19th century, even though it was invented in the 19th century, it remained pretty much in the domain of the critics, literary critics or social critics. And it wasn't institutionalized as an academic discipline in science until the late 19th and 20th centuries. In the US, for instance, departments of comparative literatures were created at Columbia in 1899, Harvard in 1904, Dartmouth College in 1908. Willamette University in 2000. So, sorry, I kind of lost my spot here. So, after World War II, comparative literature as a discipline gained a lot of success. And here's the question again: why do you think that is? Many things contributed to its success. The new technology and the facility of travel, for instance. CLA, comparative literature, knew quite international success. There were conferences called for. It favored the multiculturalism, plurilingualism, against such ideology, and I guess I'm answering my own question here, as nationalism and fascism. Both considered by comparatists to be anti-humanist in intentions. Many in international, domestic and international organizations were created and would call annual conferences, both. Right off the bat, though, in 1958, there was a disagreement between the French school and the American school of comparative literature. At the International Comparative Literature Association held in Chapel Hill in 1958, led by René Wellek, who is considered the father of comparative literature here in this country. American scholars accused their French counterparts of practicing factualism. That's a big word, isn't it? That is a theory stipulating that moral conclusions can be drawn from factual data alone. Can you think of an example of that? What? Anyway, so that was a big accusation, and of course, that's what happens in literary criticism. You see, once in a while you see a big word that comes used, and they throw you running to a dictionary to find out what it is. And so basically what it meant was that the French school focused on historical data, and they really emphasized the historical context of a work, of literary work. And as opposed to, as we will see, the opposite. This is the moment when theory came into play. So the American schools had two principles. The moral principle, which reflected the attitude of a nationwide open to the universe, and was concerned with extending to each foreign culture a democratic sympathy, but remained still very much aware of its Western roots. Okay? And that's one of the problems with comparative literature, is that since the get-go, basically, it's been mainly a European discipline or method of, and so the literatures that were compared tended to be, German, British, French, mainly, and then there were some Italian, some Spanish, a little bit of Greek, but Eastern Europe was left out of the picture, and so that to their great frustration, and actually Wellek was born in, I think he was born in Hungary originally, and moved to the United States, so he totally sympathized with the Eastern Europeans. The second principle was the intellectual principle, which would allow scholars to consider vast historical panoramas from antiquity to the 20th century. So you could have a paper on what Aristotle said at one point and what James Joyce might have said at one point, and try to link the two together. And so that the French couldn't stand it, jumping over centuries, and that's a no-no, right? And so to consider vast historical panoramas to preserve the aesthetic and human values of literature. And so that becomes very formalistic, and so the form and the content had to be considered together, as where before, in the French tradition, actually, those two were considered apart. And the third was the experiment with the most eclectic methods and interpretation without any fear of confusion. So here, what you would need to do for the C here would be to introduce theory. And that's what really ended up distinguishing the French from the American school, where here, most of the time, and within the US also, there's a split between those two things. So favoring theory above all would be sort of the idea here. Oops. I need to, did I miss a slide? Oops. Sorry. So again, French and American trends within the U.S. still true today, right? Some academics program requires that students have a reading knowledge of 2 languages and some literary theory. Others require mainly literary theory and some linguistic knowledge. A difference? Well, the difference is really political. It depends who's in charge, right? That's pretty much, that explains pretty much every disciplines in academia, right? And depends, the difference between an institution and the other. It's all political. So, for instance, here in our program, we had to change it. Originally, we required knowledge of at least 2 other languages besides English. And then we realized we didn't have customers. It didn't work. So we had to tone it down. In the introduction to comparative literature, we do use, we focus on both short stories, for instance, and theory, and try to sort of marry the two. But later on, with the seminar, then it becomes more of a research-oriented exercise on the part of the students. I think, okay, so how are we doing with time? Was that 45 minutes, and then you said that there would be 25 minutes more, and then there'd be questions, and then that's it? Or?
We have breaks, 10-minute breaks.
Oh, 10-minute breaks, okay. No, I'm not sure that I'll have enough material to go that far. But I could talk about other things, though. So Eastern origins, which is kind of interesting when you think about it, because, I mean, Western Europe is where literature was invented, where history was invented, all these disciplines were invented there, right? And at first they were kind of confused, 18th century, a scholar, or what they called in France, philosophe, which meant intellectual, like Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Diderot, Voltaire, all those people, did everything together. They would do philosophy, literature, history. I mean, they didn't know that there weren't any differences. It's only towards the end of the 19th century when the Prussians won the war against the French in 1871, that the German universities were used as a model for French universities, because they had won the war, therefore, we need to go with the winner, right? And so that's when various disciplines were institutionalized, if you will, in the academy here. And so you had sociology, history, sciences, and then all sorts of different branches under that. And starting with the late 60s and the 70s, another discipline came to be, cultural studies. Scholars grounded in cultural studies claimed that comparative literature originated during the 18th century colonialization of India. Now, cultural studies, I don't know if you're familiar with the term, is basically has been responsible for reviewing and revisiting and revisioning, if you will, the disciplines of the past, and identifying some that are imperialistic and others that aren't. Let's see here. This is one of the scholars, Siraj, Ahmed, claims that the dream of universal discourse begins with Babel. So universal discourse, this is what world literature would claim to be doing, right? If it's world and universal, But when you look at those terms, just like the word global today, right, which has superseded the word international. Global could mean local. Global means total, but not necessarily. It has nothing to do with the world itself. So that's kind of something that one needs to take into account. So Babel. His text is quite interesting. His premise is quite interesting. So the advent of philology in the 18th century, the first time that it was used, that this discourse that should contain the diversity of tongue does not. The diversity of tongue of the, besides the European tongues, right? It does not address that issue. World comparative literature did not address those issues of literature that was written in different languages from different cultures. Ahmed situates that dream with the advent of philology itself during the colonization of India and the English East India Company's approach to native populations, whose real purpose was not to embrace their diversity, but rather to subjugate them. This enterprise was facilitated through the role of William Jones, European leading Orientalist, and that's a very PC word nowadays. But when you read history, you have to run into all sorts of PC words. And arguably, the Enlightenment's greatest polymath, i.e. Somebody that knows a lot, quite knowledgeable, who in 1783 was appointed to head the English East India Company's Supreme Court in Bengal, and who 2 years after his arrival claimed that Sanskrit, Persian, Greek, and Latin were descended from a single common language, as old as, but apparently unrelated to Hebrew, which was generally thought to be the oldest language at that time, and which has since come to be known as the Indo-European thesis. Jones' thesis helped European intellectuals rethink their narrative of world history and made history a dimension inside the language. Two corollaries emerged there. The first one is the nature of people is defined by the language they speak. So by studying the language that people speak, you could come to their history and understanding of who they are and how they got there. And then the second one is that human difference across space and time can be understood, therefore, by means of philological study. So it's this science that was considered, an incredible science because, and there were a lot of religious overtone or undertone to this theory, because, when you, who is it? Is it John? No, it's not John, but who says that at the beginning there was the Word, right? In the Bible, one of the evangelists, it was John, okay. And so basically, this theory or this science is inspired from that. At the beginning there was a language, and therefore, and out of the language, the Word, the world was created. So this scholar, Siraj, goes as far as saying that, quoting another scholar, that there was that there was already mentioned in Genesis 1, for instance, that there was already a question of diversity and multilingualism, and that's because God, when He created the world, He created different species, and that's the difference between Adam and Eve and the various species who speak different languages, and how the different species should understand each other, but not necessarily communicate with the other, right? And so there's a whole scholarly stipulation on that, okay? So what Jones did. Jones' grammatical approach to history formed the basis of 19th century philology, the discipline that would presume to transcend the multiplicity of tongues. Ahmed argues that a better account of the birth of comparative literature would be to turn to Jones' work, which would allow us to explore comparative methods of 18th century roots instead of 19th, instead of Goethe. Instead of revolving around the river Rhine, local, it would return comparativism to its colonial context, global and thus universal. It would disclose comparative literature's initial political utility. And what do you think that utility is? What's that? Colonization, yes. So that's what, basically comp lit is assuming here was responsible for colonization and later colonialism, which is an interesting premise and, to some extent believable because the arguments that he provides are pretty sensible ones. So instead of revolving, the revolving around the Rhine River, meaning that that's too local, that's too European. It needs to branch out and go to. But the thing that came out of this is an interesting one that led, and one could see this pretty much through the history of literature, that there are pitfalls around these issues. So in the 19th century, the Indo-European thesis famously led to the Aryan myth, given birth in turn to the category of race, theory of race. Aryanism, according to Ahmed, is fundamental to colonialism as it was to nationalism and fascism. Traditional comparatist, Ahmed claims, unbeknownst to themselves, were caught in the trap of the humanism and secularism, which was a 19th century movement that wanted to transform European society in line with demands of industrial capitalism. And thus informed philology. So it's that ideology or that doctrine, if you will, informed philology. Ahmed proposes that to get out of the trap, quote, we would need to begin a colonial archaeology of historical method and to analyze colonial legal and print cultures. The latter have had much more global influence and are usually located outside of the academy, along with the academic studies. So in other words, he's proposing, let's get away from the canon and go look at these writings that were left out by the canon, because the canon, is something that was, dates from the late 19th century again, and it was to foster a national identity in people. And so it's a pretty interesting history when you look at it. What books would be considered French, to give the, so that the people could identify with a certain history and legend. So, for instance, in French, it's La Chanson de Roland, Roland's song, which was written, actually, initially it was written as a European epic poem, because there's all sorts of other people that participate in Charlemagne's conquests. But then it was edited, if you will, and it became exclusively French. And that is the one, that's the first text, for instance, that French students read when they start reading literature, when they begin to study literature. So that's the only problem with Ahmed's argument is that the field of cultural studies itself is a Western invention. It was not invented in India. The discipline of cultural studies, it was invented in the US. So that's the only problem with using that venue to analyze something that should be done about what we do, but in reality what happens is that you're using the same weapon, the same tool, the same discipline, the same doctrine in order to come to a conclusion that, then if you step back, you realize that you're still where you started. So I think I'm going to stop here right now and see if there are any questions, and then we'll come back and talk about the history of ideas. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Are you the? Oh, the microphones. Okay.
That's why nobody said anything when you asked questions, because we're permitted not to speak unless we have a microphone.
Is that right? Okay. I didn't know
Yeah,
that. I
pretty
didn't know.
As a reminder, the best way to hold these microphones in this room, and it varies other places, would be like as if you're going to play a trumpet. Out here doesn't work. Microphone fear doesn't work. So get it up to your mouth. And please identify yourself by name. That's so very helpful.
My name is David. I'm very interested in the term patriotic science. I don't think science can be patriotic. It doesn't have that meaning. Science is universal. Would you discuss that a little bit, please?
No, I agree with you. But this is what was claimed, that science was patriotic. Actually, if you listen to what's coming out of D.C. right now, the same claim is being used, that the way we do science is more American than other people do science. So that discourse is still around. It's a discourse that's linked to nationalistic ideology. And so once that comes into favor, because you have to imagine that these ideologies go in and out, or they're like a pendulum. They swing left and right, and then they have more of a presence than other times. And so that's what a nationalistic discourse would claim, that everything we do in a country, in a nation, we do it for patriotic reason, and therefore those things are patriotic.
Hi.
Okay.
Oh.
This is Bob down here.
Oh,
Okay,
Bob.
we usually alternate sides.
Okay.
You use two terms that I think it's important for you to explain to the ICL group here today. And they're very important terms. I know what they mean. I think I do. Theory and canon. But some of the members here probably do not know what those terms mean. Theory is a particularly complex idea. Canon, I think, can be defined more simply. But would you explain what you mean by those two terms?
Sure. Theory first. Basically, when you, it entails having done quite a bit of comparison. Whether you're a scientist, whether you're a literary person, or an artist, you having done those comparisons, you come up with the sort of the structure, if you will, for lack of a better term, of the material that you've been dealing with, be it language or be it marble or whatever it is. And then from there, you draw certain, you make an outline of what that structure is, and for people to, and then you use that to apply to other things. It's like having a grid that you sort of apply to all sorts of situations and make everything fit there. So theory, if you will, is helpful that way, in a way, because it kind of, it's a way to sort of summarize, if you will, condense your activity or your, but at the same time it could be treacherous, especially when you sort of apply it indiscriminately in different areas. And so it doesn't always work, right? Was that clear? Or?
Those colonial Marxist queer theories, there's a lot of...
Right. Well,
Explain how one or two of those might work.
Can you repeat his question?
Yes.
explain how he gave some, Bob gave some examples like Marxism is a theory, Freudianism, anything that ism, right, would be kind of a doctrine slash theory. And so basically, well, if you take Marxism, for instance, everybody knows remember Marxism, right? You heard of Karl Marx, right? Okay. So I mean, and you probably know more than I do. So if I, basically, Marx said that capitalism is a problem, okay, and so that we need to go. A better system would be socialism, right? And so what he did, he wrote these 3 big volumes of analyzing what capital, das Kapital, what capital was, and he condensed it down to the smallest meaningful unit, right? And so basically concluded that, in order to actually guess what the value of a certain item, this thing is, you have to take into account the raw material that were extracted, and then what the amount of labor that went into it. And so those 2 things, the combination of those 2 things, spoke to the value of an item. The value of this bottle doesn't correspond to the price that is applied to it, because that's speculation. In other words, the vendor will tag a price that doesn't necessarily, which is above what the actual value of that item is. So what happens is that, like any theory, right, you end up with vulgarization of that. People that don't necessarily understand the true meaning of the spoken words, and ended up extrapolating or applying it or applying it to other things. So we're all afraid of communism here, right? Which is associated with Marxism. Apparently that's where it came from. And then the word socialism also had a big, was not, it's a concept not very welcomed. And so that would be an example. I mean, the way it became vulgarized throughout history is an example of the danger of a theory, okay? That it doesn't correspond to the actual what Marx said, but the interpretations of Marx were responsible for the way people felt. Because, Marxism was married with psychology later on. It was married with linguistics. It was married with, in terms of intellectual theory and endeavors. And of course, cultural studies uses Marxism quite a bit in their interpretation of the colonizers and the colonized, the imperialists and the victims of that. Was that clear? Yeah, sorry. Okay. Oh, the canon. Sorry, I forgot about the canon. The canon, literary canon, is what many Western countries and the U.S. to some extent, decided that, this is pre-technology, pre-television, pre-this and that, that they wanted to foster a national identity. What does it mean to be French? What does it mean to be English, to be German, et cetera, et cetera. So they came up with a literary canon that they put together a list of books, right? From the Middle Ages to the present, the 20th century, and they've been adding to it, quite a bit, until the 60s, until everybody sort of rebelled against the canon, and so they put key texts that everybody had to study in school, and so every kid that came out of the American public school system had to know about certain. What it meant to be American, what it meant to, what happened, what the forefathers did, what Washington, when he crossed the Delaware, Paul Jones, right? What did he do? Didn't, the epic poem. And of course, at the beginning of the canon, there was always an epic poem. So La Chanson de Roland would be an epic poem. And that was sort of emulating a little bit the classical literature, because the first, not the first, but the most important written text that was written down was the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. So, and a lot of the texts that these various nations put together, the canon, that emulated those texts from antiquity.
Hi, my name's Cassia. I'm quite interested in your discussion here of language and the comparison of things. And it's been kind of my observation that over time, having lived pretty much everywhere, that people who are truly bilingual actually think in two different modes, depending on what language they're speaking at the time. And so if that works for literature, how does the comparison part work when you have an author whose, say, primary language is like maybe Joseph Conrad was probably Polish or something, and yet he wrote these marvelous works in English? How do you translate that? I mean, is it a comparative thing, or you just stick with what he wrote and compare the English to other English and the Polish to other Polish or the German to other German? I mean, a good example of that is Chinese poetry, where any character can have multiple meanings depending on who the translator is. Mm-hmm. So how does the comparison work?
Yeah, and the translator is key to some extent. And like Dante said about translator, is that the translator is a traitor because it betrays the original intent of the author. In that, in order for us to understand Dante or Homer or people from antiquity or Shakespeare for that matter, right? Periodically, there's always some kind of a new edition that comes out, a new translation that comes out, because so that they could speak to the generation that's going to read it. And so some terms don't correspond, to what Shakespeare might have used at the time, or Homer definitely. But to go back to your question, I think that in my case, I'm a trilingual person, and I switch between languages, depending on the context. For instance, I wouldn't be able to switch right now. But if I were within a certain group of people that spoke that particular language, I would hesitate to switch. So that's my thing. But when it comes to reading, I could go from French to English, to Italian, and some Spanish also, and be able to compare, because some of the words are similar, the grammar structure is similar. So I'm stuck in the, if you will, in the European tradition of doing comparative literature in that sense. I'd have to read things that are published in the, in the Southeast, Southeast Asia, if you will, in translation to be able to do the comparison. Besides the fact that, when we teach a course here at Willamette, everything has to be in translation, if you see what I'm saying. Because, with the option that the students could read the material in the original language. And sometimes we compare a passage here and there to show the students precisely what the problems, both in translations and interpretations, might be. But the going back and forth is something that usually comparatists, do. Now, as I said earlier, some are just interested in applying the theory, and they have, minimal understanding of the other language. They could read it, but not necessarily speak it, for instance. And then others might be a little bit more bilingual, if you will, with, of course, the language, their native language being the strongest. One needs to go abroad and live in the country, because a language is more than just words, right? It's culture, and sometimes, that culture, you have to absorb it through your pores, so to speak. You have to be there and sense it, and the sensing cannot be learned. There's no formula for that.
Hi, my name is Ingrid. Is there any comparative literature to Goethe's Faust?
Yeah, actually, yes. I'm going to talk about it in my second part of the presentation. Yes, of course.
That kind of brings us to the fact that there are two parts to our morning. And
Okay.
This might be a good time for us to take a break. You've awakened a lot of thinking, and this is really an interesting topic. Thank you so much, and let's take 10 minutes.
Welcome back. I hope you had a nice break. So in this second part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about the history of ideas. What does that entail? And the term, as I said earlier, the term should be understood in a strict definition, as a strict definition or category. Sorry, should not be understood in those ways, such as philosophical or scientific, political, but rather as a sentimental sentimental ideas, or as literary expression of sensibility, which I'll explain in a second. Along with that, literary ideas such as literary doctrines, schools, tendencies, movements, called, presented and discussed by writers themselves, or still system invented by critics in order to better grasp a fleeting or vanishing reality, such as the Baroque, the Classicism, or the Classic, or the Realism would be another one, can also inform a piece of fiction or become connecting bridges between two compared works from different literary traditions. For instance, without the knowledge of moral and philosophical ideas, we wouldn't be able to understand Shelley without Plato. Could we understand these people without knowing where they might have gotten the ideas before? Perhaps, but our understanding of it would be quite limited. So when you think about it, for instance, if you take Dante, Corneille, Goethe, Schiller, and to some extent Taine in French, were considered by the canon to be patriotic writers. But actually, look where they got their inspiration. Hegel, Taine got inspiration from Hegel, right, in his system. Kafka from Kierkegaard. Pope without Leibniz, it doesn't really make much sense. Diderot without Stern, and Stern without Locke, that wouldn't make any sense in order to understand them, because these are writers that haven't read Locke, haven't read Spinoza, haven't read, sort of built on that argument. And in order to understand their arguments, then, more clearly and the evolution of it, then you need to have done some, their interpretation is better if you compare and contrast with. So similarly, Dante, Pascal, Fénelon, Rousseau, Milton, Chateaubriand, Dostoevsky, among others, are not church fathers. However, their inspiration is steeped in religious ideas and make clear reference to either Buddha, Confucius, Christ, Muhammad, Luther, or Calvin. Those authors are inspired by religion. Similarly, again, scientific ideas derived from physics and geology bear a great influence on Voltaire and Goethe. Darwin's notion influenced Shelley's work, as Dr. Lucas' notions on heredity influenced Émile Zola's work. Gleiss's system on the Aryan race influenced Wagner. And the 19th century, was really obsessed with science and scientism, if you will, because there's all sorts of bogus studies that came up, were actually considered seriously enough, that were basically determining how people behave, and this is the sort of the foray of sociology initially into the domain of analysis. So scientific ideas. I talked about religious idea. Plato, Bacon, More, Hobbes, Machiavelli, Locke, Vico's political ideas can be found in Montesquieu, Burke, Comte, Hegel, Marx, and others. Again, as with the previous ideas, political ideas must be understood in the broad sense of the term. For instance, as the Greeks understood it, a writer belongs to a family, to a city, to a society, to a nation. That's political. If you belong to all these things. In this sense, writing is a political act. Even when writing for a writing club, or art circle, for that matter, or a particular reader, the writer or poet words constitutes a political, personal political act, right? So writing is political. Even when you write a personal letter to someone, you're committing a political act. What do you think of that? Did you know that? Many of you probably think that you're apolitical. You want to stay away from politics and all that. Well, no, because you have to think of language. Language has, especially the part of language that's considered convention, right? Society. I think I was talking to someone earlier. The language belongs to society. Okay, we all use the language. We make personal use of it, right? So we know to call a table and not a chair, right? Society decide that, not us in particular. You may have a particular shape of a table in mind, round, octagonal, rectangular, whatever shape, that marked you at one point. That was the first impression of a table that you had. And therefore, you assume that all tables are square, all tables are oval, all tables are short. But that's not the case, right? So the personal, I don't know if you're familiar with Ferdinand de Saussure, who wrote, he didn't, his students pulled together his courses on linguistics, where he talked about langue et langage. Langue would be the social convention of language, all the rules and the codes. while langage would be the personal use that one does, or parole, sometimes he calls it parole. Okay. And so that's what we're talking about. So when, a parole, or which corresponds to speech, or discourse, if you will, imposes itself on the langue, that's where we have a fascist situation, a fascist situation, where you're being forced to speak a certain language, and that's problematic, I think. And so every time that people try to legislate, when a small group legislates language, that's something that we need to worry about. So the history of ideas is sort of entails the difference between literary feelings such as virtue, happiness, death, freedom, etc., and feelings in literature. So those are two different concepts. You could do a study, you can notice the literary feelings, the virtue, you read a book, especially in the 18th century, they like to sort of show virtuous people how they were honest and they were wise and et cetera, compared to the despotic situation, that one was confronted with. But feelings in literature, the latter assumed to be simple feelings. People would be disappointed if a particular literary genre were to vanish, right? We all like to read certain novels, right? Detective novels, love, romance, or tragedies, and So imagine if one of those genres was to disappear, right? Because the genre itself is an idea, is a feeling, right? In literature, right? A comparatist identifies the undercurrent feelings, be they of a certain use of language, of fashion, of intellectual climate, expressed in a work such as the Werther, the Wagner's work on the romantic hero par excellence, Chateaubriand, René's, were heroes, literary heroes who sort of went and poured their emotions in a lake, in a forest, and spoke of love in grandiloquent terms. Those people. So that would be a particular type of book, right? And a particular type of author, hero. So that would be also a feeling, You like to read about these type of authors, these type of heroes. And so that's the feeling that you experience yourself, right? And you go towards those. Or you want to read about man in the state of nature before civilization corrupted him. That's when you would turn to Rousseau, and of course you have to take into account Locke, who said, the state of nature was a state of warfare. People, and then they got so tired of it that they decided to form a society. But they had to leave all their, they had to compromise to get in, right? All their sort of liberties they had experienced earlier in state of nature had to be given up, and the rule of law had to be imposed. Or Rousseau would say, well, no, what happened in society was that, man was born good. Society corrupted him, made him bad, right? By creating three types of inequalities. The first one was private property. The second one was legislature. And the third one was despotic power, monarchical power at the time. And so those three things, those are the three main inequalities in society when the society was formed. And the one thing that keeps them, the fuel that keeps them going, is vanity. So, and so we consider ourselves better than others. We consider ourselves, superior to others, and that's a question of vanity, according to Rousseau, right? So maybe you'd like to read about what man was like in the, in the state of nature. And so that would be, again, that would be a literary feeling in literature. Another thing would be ephemerality of time that is intimate, incarnate in the melancholia felt before an ancient ruins or a tomb, expressed in a literary work. So, imagine, for instance, René, who is this romantic hero of Chateaubriand, was sort of Chateaubriand was imitating Goethe, Werther, and at one point he goes, he's totally unsatisfied with the situation in France because the French Revolution ruined everything, because he was from an aristocratic background, minor aristocracy, but he still identified with them. And so he left France and traveled through the known world at the time, and he went to ancient Greece, and cried in front of those ruins. He went to Scotland, and there were ruins over there too, and he cried over there too. And then he migrated, he couldn't take it anymore, and migrated to the US, and ended up in the Mississippi region, that time, well, not that time, but when the thing is set, the story is set, the Louisiana was still part of France. And so he went among the Natchez, Native Americans, and basically, they were the only ones that understood them because they were closer to nature, right? That's another thing from the 18th century, that when you're closer to nature, you're much more wise as a person and much more true to yourself and others. So the other thing is, even though, so the history of ideas also includes art, because in art, artists express feelings in their art, right? Whether it's a poem, whether it's a painting, they start with a feeling, and then when they put that feeling down on a canvas, it takes a certain shape, right? And the feeling has something to do with the state of society at that point. Or it could be a political statement. It could be, an expression of love, et cetera, et cetera. So, although art and literature may seem at first incompatible, in that arts are addressed to humanity in general, while literature, even in translation, speaks to an unlimited number of people. Many are the examples of comparison between literature and fine arts. For instance, if I were to teach a course entitled Faust in France, I would have to take into account the symphonic and tone poems and Berlioz's La Damnation de Faust, 1846, or Gounod's Faust, and they're both from 19th century. I don't know if you realize that, but what was the 19th century thinking about? So these are images of the productions of, and this Mephistopheles from 1915 is quite an interesting character. Or Goethe's play Faust inspired painters, Harry Schaefer, or lithographers, lithographs by Eugène Delacroix, for instance, on Faust. So Faust in the mid-19th century France was very, very popular because it was Satan, if you will, was the Satan that they were thinking about was a victim of the capitalist system and the sort of the imperialistic politics of the time. And they were thinking of Milton's Satan, right? I don't know if you're familiar with Milton's Satan. He was the angel that was cast to earth because he rebelled against God. And so anybody that rebelled against the system was considered a hero in 19th century literature, especially Balzac, for instance, or Victor Hugo, right? Misérable, right? Jean Valjean would be considered a victim of the system, a victim and therefore a hero to be followed because, you know. So anyway, so that was kind of an aesthetic of the time. It was an anti-establishment aesthetic, if you will, but it was very much part of the discourse of the time. Here's another Gustave Doré. I don't know if you're familiar with this. Gustave Doré is more like towards the end of the 19th century, second half of 19th century. He did all sorts of lithographs of classic. So he's got one on Shakespeare, he's got one on Milton, he's got one on various, even Homer. And they sort of, so this is a representation of Dante going into hell and not, hiding his face. He's being led by Virgil, who was his guide. And so again, Dante wrote the Divine Comedy, but he has Virgil, this Latin poet, Roman poet, as a character in this story, right? And as a guide for Dante himself, who had basically a middle-age crisis, What did you do when you had a middle-age crisis? Where'd you go? Did you go to hell? You might as well. When you think about it, right? And so, that would be the utility of such a work, right? It would be, that corresponds to a certain moment in our lives where we actually identify with the work, right? It speaks to that moment. Milton's Lost Paradise is another lithograph by Gustave Doré, who has if you go to Paris, there's a museum dedicated to his work, and you could actually see some of these lithographs in the drawers, these big drawers that highly recommended. So, before we get there, in the interest of the comparison between literature and art, is precisely, the interest of comparison between literature and art is precisely for the reader or viewer to transgress the limits imposed by specialized disciplines, history, politics, literature, biology, etc. They tend to sort of limit the knowledge, but comparative literature transgresses that, They take a little inspiration from everything. Not indiscriminately, of course, but as long as it makes sense in the analysis. And for them, for the disciplines, to experience the reader, to experience life through the arts. Thus, comparative literature helps us to become aware of the ideas or intellectual exchanges, such as the correspondences between literature and the arts, allowing us to bring them closer together or to simply challenge them. through aesthetics, one can better understand the complexity of life. Because aesthetics tends to encapsulate that experience. And aesthetics is the notion of what is beauty, or what the beautiful, not beauty, okay, the beautiful. We all have a notion of that within us, what we consider beautiful, the ethical, how those two things correspond to one another in our vision, in our worldview, our personal worldview, but also as a social worldview, right? So you could go through things and it's like sort of second guess what that may be for you, but also for how it compares to society at large. So aesthetics makes us see the complexity of life, or understand it. So the other, actually I'm ahead of myself here, the comparative literature today, and I'll explain this word in a little bit. So in today's dramatic changes in academia, comp lit should continue to play an important role. It is a pedagogical method that encompasses the past and the present, the old and the new. It is inter and multidisciplinary. It is multilingual. It furthermore should inform academic values such as cultural and linguistics, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and speak to the morals of changing society. It should help bridge the gap more directly between academia and society, art and life. But for that, as Francesco Loriggio suggests, we need to think in terms of globalization, a compound term out of globalization and localization, as well as face unpleasant politics of disciplinary division in academia, and that's what, one of the main obstacles. So the thing about what comparative literature needs to do is really to be universal, to be global, or to be world literature. It needs to really embrace other culture more with open arms, more so than it has done in the past. And to try not to impose what cultural studies tends to do, theory on cultures. Because, well, do you think that theory is something that Africans ever used for? Or anywhere, in third world country, do you think they think in terms of theory? It's another invention of the Western world. It's another invention of capitalism to have a theory and to apply that everywhere. So that needs to change. That needs to sort of, we need to take the local and bring it up to the global, if you will, and to sort of try to understand the here and there, and the sort of think globally, but was the phrase years ago, and what? And act locally. Thank you. So this is actually all I have right now, but I'd be happy to answer questions. I mean, I could go on and talk about perhaps one more thing that came up during the question period is that the situation nowadays with cultural studies and also gender studies. I mean, gender studies is part of cultural studies. It's, Marxism is part of It's a combo of many things, cultural studies, what we call cultural studies. And so the embracing of diversity, the embracing of this, but ironically, they're moving towards what I call a monolingualism, because they're coming up with one way of talking, one way of addressing life and society. And that's kind of dangerous, I think, because it brings us closer to a situation of fascism, because that's what fascism does. It imposes a speech. It imposes a discourse that limits other, from, forbids others from speaking, limits other people's language. And so that's one danger that one could see in this particular movement. But of course, language has a mind of its own. Every time language has been, people have tried to legislate language, it's never worked, it's never stuck. There are words that remain, and those are sort of, the mile markers of where language has been. But we don't speak 18th century language anymore, right? But imagine the whole society that was speaking it back then, right? We don't speak, Mussolini's language anymore. But imagine how everybody was forced to do that, right? Anyway, so that's what I have to say. Thanks. Thank you.
I've been trying to imagine what it would be like being a student taking your course.
They interrupt all the time.
So, for example, in the teaching mode that you would be in, would you recommend that someone read this book and then make a comparison with some other base book as a way of starting this teaching program out? How would you, the practicality of how you start to teach?
To teach this? Well, the first course that I showed, the 250, CLHI 250, is basically we read, the way I've taught it is to read short stories, European short stories, and to use the literary theory that was in vogue at the time the short story was written. So that would be one approach. To see whether the sort of the theory, which usually is created after the short story was written, whether it does justice to the short story. That's one way of teaching it, Another way would be to sort of focus on a theme. I don't know, love through the centuries, and come up with texts that speak about love. Now, of course, love, oh, wow, the students get all sort of cuckoo gaga about love. But actually, when you start analyzing love at a certain historical moment, it was totally, say, the Middle Ages France, love was, there were two versions of the marriage, for instance. You either married for a reason, or you married for love. The reason was, always had to do with some aspect of geopolitical alliances and et cetera, et cetera. Arthur and Guinevere got married because, their territory, their domain, their kingdom became larger, or it was an alliance between different tribes. Or it could be, married for love, which was not a real marriage, it was outside the marriage. So, adultery. A lot of, Lancelot and Guinevere. It's a story of adultery. So it was outside of marriage. And so those two ideas were sort of in conflict with one another back then. But then as you move forward, you realize, you get to the 17th century and you realize that up until a certain moment, only Catholic marriages were recognized by the state and no one else. It's only towards the end of the 17th century that they allowed civil marriages, but not to be recorded by the state, to just issue some kind of a certificate about it. And that was the thing that so it wasn't considered legal, if you will, but it was allowed. Okay, so what kind of a love story is that, right? And I guess if you weren't Catholic and you really wanted to get married, maybe, one would say, well, that was true love. They actually loved each other to the point where they went against the system, right? Because that's what true love does, right? You go against the system. Romeo and Juliet went against the system, right? Didn't they? So I'm saying, you could do a whole sociological reading and political reading of what the word love is, through the centuries, right? And there's economics in there too. I'm not neglecting that aspect. That love translated into money, or the fact that it had entailed private property was also part of that, right?
Me? I'm wondering what the goal is for a student who majors in comparative literature. Would they dispute some already critique of somebody else's, or would they try to find something that nobody had written about?
Yeah, everybody would like to do that, by the way. But as an academic discipline, the main purpose is to teach them a skill to, that entails reading, analyzing, comparing, that type of skill, and then to critically converse with the text, not necessarily critically in the sense that they have to build up an argument and say, okay, well, for instance, so many scholars have seen this text in such and such a vein. However, there's this aspect of what they said that doesn't quite match with the text. And because there's this other text that speaks about the same thing, and I see that as echoing that other text versus echoing an older text or something like that. So, in other words, if they're dealing with two different languages, that's more of the type of argument that they might make, because then the issue becomes, well, the translator betrayed the intent. He didn't do a good job translating such and such a phrase, such and such a word, such and such a scene, and therefore there's an argument to be made there. But this for undergraduates, it's really like something very they try to converse, but of course they lack. They have many more years of reading to do in order to get to the missing piece of the puzzle, if you will. That entails spending many years. Or many days, long days in a library somewhere and reading everything you get a hold of.
Hi, this is Gwen Ellen. It kind of follows what you're saying, but I'd like to know, to what extent do your students enter the class? How familiar are they with some of the works that you're using, the philosophers and...
Right. Ideally, they should be. It depends on the student. Some have heard. heard mentioned or have seen a movie that was, or somebody's song that, like, for instance, not the Beatles, but the Rolling Stones came up when I taught that course on evil, parsing evil. What? The song, so that's a valid thing, because, I mean, we're still, even though evil is, we strive for the good, but for some reason, evil always wins, And if evil wasn't around, we wouldn't have a story. What kind of story would you tell with good? Well, it's good. I mean, you wouldn't go very far, right? Once you said good, well, that's good. So it's fine because so that's so to go back to your question, they sometimes I have to tell them what literature is. So today, I mean, they come. They're really, you need to start from scratch, or you have to assume that they are at that level. And of course, once you realize they may not be, then you sort of, change a little bit and what you do. But you have to assume they're not.
Hi, this is Wally. So a couple of years ago in the news, Reed College got into the news by having their traditional list of great books that every freshman was required to read, and there were student protests, including sitting silently on the podium in front of the speaker to try to again, I think, get the books that aren't included in the canon to be included. Mm-hmm. So I gather Willamette doesn't have a list of required great books, but just wanted to know what the state of that assumption about what makes an educated person is. Has that idea gone out of favor in academia, or is it still an idea that has relevance?
Yeah, we have to go back to Harold Bloom, who said that, who wrote The Closing of the American Mind. That's when Latin and Greek were, or the classic curriculum went out the window, or people stopped teaching it. No, what we have at Willamette compared to Reed is we don't have they have a series of humanities courses and different levels, freshman, sophomore, and junior, I think. And the purpose of those courses is to read the classic at the first year, I think, or the first semester, I think it's a year. And then to sort of branch out in different other areas of reading. They could do romanticism, or they could do, they could have a theme of sort. And of course, that canon didn't include, was not as diverse enough. Even though a lot of schools have been recruiting diversity students, and so, but they're not delivering their promise, so to speak, to these students. As compared to Reed, what we have is a series of, we have a freshman colloquium, which is a freshman seminar, that has a specific theme to it. So the students could choose whichever one they want. So there's a choice from the get-go. And what the seminar does, or it should do, is teach them how to read and write. I mean, that ultimately, those are the skills that we try to foster in them. And then to sort of, to discuss, those are the three activities that they do. And so they have a lot of choices in that. So for instance, I'm teaching, I tend to be more classic than anybody else. I'm teaching a course of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his controversial heritage. And we're reading mainly Rousseau, but we're talking about Locke and Hobbes and, and Hume and all sorts of other philosophers of the time. But we alternating between his confessions and his political writings. And so that's where the controversy is, because he confessed. And of course, it's called Confession, right? And there is another, of course, you automatically know that there is another book called Confessions, right? Who? Augustine, Saint Augustine, right, in antiquity. But his confession was his, finding God and revelation and all that. Rousseau's is completely secular. It's considered the first modern autobiography. And he is, it's anti-Cartesian, because, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And Rousseau says, I felt, therefore I was. And so he claims to be telling the history of his feelings, or the history of his soul, and narrating, his feelings, not the facts. The facts don't count. Okay, so, and of course, he's all over the map when it comes to that. And of course, the students say, he's contradicting himself. He just said this here, and then look at it. And then they read the political discourse, and he's extremely logical there. And so they're torn by the whole thing. And that's basically the purpose of the course, is to make them feel that tension between the personal and the public, if you will, the public voice and the private voice, and how whether we should judge the public voice according to the private voice, which we tend to do, right? At least these times, we think that the author is such and such a person and believes in such and such a thing, and therefore that explains the book. Like father, like son, which is like, no, it's, right? It's the narrator speaking in a book, and the author actually evolves, right? 10 years later, you wouldn't write the same book. So you can't pin him down to that and say, And so do we judge Jean-Jacques Rousseau according to what he says in his confession? Or do we judge him according to what he says in his political discourse and philosophical discourse, which has had, or pedagogical discourse, and he wrote these treatises on how to educate a young man and how to educate a young woman. They have had a lot of influence in teaching since then, pedagogy. If you think of the Montessori schools, for instance, is inspired by Rousseau. The Waldorf schools is inspired by Rousseau. And countless of other private schools are all you could find Rousseau in what they do or what they say. Or was he did he advocate totalitarianism like he was thought to be or to do in the 50s, 1950s here? Or was he responsible for the French Revolution? Yeah, he was responsible for all those things, right? We know that, right? He wrote the social contract too, And even though he was a liberal, he was, philosophical, he also advocated for the capital punishment, for everybody had to think the same way, believe in the same way, and the sovereign, the people, had the ultimate say. So all these things, that's just an example of a course that the student who first semester of Willamette is exposed to, and other colleagues are teaching other courses that where similar issues come up and surface. Yeah.
Well, I think we all want to sit at each other's lunch tables to see what the conversation is. There's so much to think about. We thank you so much for being here today.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for your questions.